Well, hopefully most of you know me from a few weeks back, but just super quickly, if anyone doesn't. So I'm Kieran. I was 2016 full-time graduate. On the back of that, joined Bain for 4.5 years, and then mid last year made the jump and went to corporate. And now I'm a head of strategy at Australia Post. Had a lot of involvement with the consulting club, both at my time at MBS, where I was a case lead, and then post, working with sort of 3 or 4 different execs actually on building out a better way of thinking about case and learning about case and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's come a long way. I think there's still a ways to go, and Sam and Joel and this crew are doing a good job and sort of taking the next step and moving that forward. But yeah, so I'll share screen. Look, the intent of this session, this one's potentially even more interactive than a lot. I know that's a little bit challenging with a big group on VC, but 2 forms would be super useful. If you're more comfortable with the chat, just please jump and answer things in the chat function, and I'll reply all to everyone. But also feel free to, as we go through, keep your mic, get ready, your mouse over the unmute button and unmute, and let's answer questions and get involved. I will, if I need to, start calling on people to have a go at some of the things, like having a go at clearing slides, and then we'll talk through sort of how I might do it and take that sort of approach. But if there's limited volunteers, you'll get volunteered. Because I think that's the way this sort of session particularly needs to work to you guys get the most out of it. So sharing screen, share, let me reset this up. Sorry, I'm just get myself sorted. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, and apologies, I'm actually just channeling all the little tricks for using setting up a multiple screens to make it work better, best for. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is a few things, as Sam suggested. So I've sort of said there's 3 topics and some time for questions. So the 3 topics are there is thinking like a CEO in business judgment, in-case brainstorming and sort of creating your own exhibits and input to a case, and clearing slides. Now, they're quite different, but kind of linked topics. I think thinking like a CEO in business judgment is that something you need to have throughout the case to do well. And for me, actually, this is one of the secret sources to doing well at cases, and I'll talk about why that is and how I think you can practice it. Because if I think back to the interviewing people at consultant level, some of the things when people aren't able to do this well are some of the big things that mean they don't progress and aren't successful in interviews. In case brainstorming comes up a little bit, and I'll have some examples of when it comes up and how you might think about it. And that's really linked to thinking like a CEO. If you do one well, you tend to do the other one, the second one well. So they're quite linked. And then clearing slides is like a key skill for a consultant, as well as and for case interviews. So it's a really important one because you will get exhibits and things like that throughout the case. You'll need to process, and you need to do it in a repeatable and effective and logical way. So just to sort of reiterate, clearing the slide is obviously all about the exhibits and the information you get given in the case. And so that's where that links in. And the other 2 really come into the setup but then all through the case in terms of how you're thinking about the problem. So let's start with thinking like a CEO and business judgment. So actually, first is a question, and this is starting. Who is this? Does anyone know who this is? No one got any view. Okay, so well, it's one I don't actually expect you to know who it is unless someone happened to love that. There's a little bit of a hint in terms of where he's standing and what he's holding.
I'm guessing it's Treasury Wine Estates, something like that.
Yeah, it's Tim Ford, who's the head of Treasury Wine Estates. Now, imagine you're Tim Ford. And other than the things around lockdown in Victoria, because I think he is Victorian based, let's have a chat about what's keeping him up at night. What's the 2 or 3 things in a business context for Treasury Wines that's keeping him up at night?
The China ban on wine.
Definitely.
Yeah, China.
That's, I mean, you could make a case that there's only one thing keeping him up at night, and it's the Chinese the import tariffs into China. But I mean, maybe let's go a little bit further and go. I really believe that is probably number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and down to 10. But if we go, let's take that aside and go, what else? If that wasn't happening, what else might be keeping Tim up at night? So let's say we go back a year, and that was before that China tariffs had happened, and his business was blown up in some extent. What else? What would have been keeping him up at night before that?
Grape yields, Kieran, maybe? Like, how much they're getting out of their crops at the moment?
No, I don't think so. I think the reason why I don't think so is because they have hundreds of different wineries across multiple different regions, both in Australia and probably a few around the world. So yeah, at a base level, if a number of their big important things had crappy yields and shitty wine, then it'd have a problem. But I think it's getting too granular. That sort of problem is keeping viticulturalists and the particular brand managers and things like that awake. Probably not keeping Tim. I mean, he's going to be conscious of it. Viticulture and the white is super important, but not probably one of the top few, I would have thought.
Is it sort of like the divestments and that they'd made recently, or acquisitions that they'd made before that, and how they're being performing?
Yeah, and how they've been integrating potentially. If if a CEO is part of a business that's made lots of acquisitions and been brought into the company, that's going to be the type of high-level strategic thing that he's or she is going to be really interested in, and how that's going and where that's tracking, because they are sort of big decisions that they've been involved heavily in.
I'd say changing drinking trends, how the competition's changing, who's producing wine,
Love it.
new countries, that sort of thing.
And not just wine, Alistair. I mean, beer, the rise of craft beer, the rise of spirits and gin. And so the shifting nature of the consumer market, and I'd say there's 2 parts, and I think you've called out one. One is globally, what's happening globally and which markets, and that links into the China one eventually. But also, even in Australia, like what's happening in terms of the type of wine people are drinking and wanting to drink, which is shifting a lot, but also the substitutes that are probably impacting his market and taking that real consumer view. Markets sort of being acquired. I don't know if Treasury it could be acquired somewhere, but I think they're pretty big. I think they're more about breaking up. They were talking about spinning off Penfolds and some other things. So it's more about probably the other way of them divesting and breaking up the company to maximize the value.
Hey, Kieran, I believe that they're a listed company, so maybe it's too macro, but just looking at their list price, because that's probably how he's reflected.
I don't think it's too macro. If you're a CEO, how you paid generally, I don't know how his contract works. I mean, you're paid based on often your long-term bonus is in shares and share options. So I think 100% he cares about the share price in it in terms of how it's performing, and that's because that's generally how CEOs are incentivized. So I think there's some really good things here, and I'll talk about why this is really important as we get through. But let's have a go at another one. Who's this man? Once again, the picture gives away some of the gives you some hints. And I apologize on the examples. Late last night, I have all men, and that's terrible because there's some fantastic female CEOs around, all white men, I think, as well, which is even worse. So I apologize because that's poor because there is a plethora of well, my CEO was female when we had one. She walked the plank last year after the Cartier watch scandal, and so we've now actually got our acting CEO, which is our CFO, and they're looking to appoint a new one into sort of April. The board's working through that at the moment. But Christine was female. She was a lovely person doing a really good job, other than some real political aspects that maybe she walked into a minefield on. So who's this man? Brad, it is. Yeah, and you got the Woolworths tags in the background. Love it. So let's have a talk about him. What's keeping Brad up at night at the moment? The 2 or 3 biggest things that are on front of mind for him as a CEO of Woolies.
How do you keep the right stock going versus your supply chains during COVID?
Yeah, I think supply chain during COVID is probably a massive one, given the bumps that's caused. It'd be one that, and he's often on the press around and having to front the media on and things like that. That's a good one.
I'd say he'd be worried about Amazon and Co as well.
Would he? Maybe at the back. I think you can't. I mean, you think he would be worried about is there online and is there going to be alternatives? I don't know if it's keeping him up at night. I think it's an issue, but maybe not keeping him up at night. What else? What
Staff
else?
safety at the moment.
Yeah, love it. No, Nick, and that's a great one. My staff are the front line. They're essential workers. They're out interacting with people. You know, COVID scares in stores. How am I out? And that part of it would be a huge one for him. As part through COVID. That's a great one.
Maybe on the supply chain theme as well, the balance to getting to regional Australia, because there was a whole lot of regional Australians thinking that there was a difference between metro and regional supplies, and sort of throwing up a fuss about it. So trying to get that balance.
If that's making press and he's worried about bad, I think he's probably tell you it's not an issue, but that it's the potential bad press from it's an issue, and that's something he might be thinking about. I mean, I think those are probably some good ones for Brad. I think really about my staff safety. How am I going to keep supplying? And look, I don't disagree that he's going to be thinking about I'd go more than maybe a bit broader than Amazon and think about the shifting nature of competition and how he's serving customers. So the rise of click and collect and how I'm meeting that. How am I getting my deliveries sorted? What is the competition going to look like going forward? And I mean, clearly he also cares about what Coles and Aldi are doing, because it's a pretty three-horse market. So he's going to probably keeping a pretty close eye on some of those things. And Coles have been taking back a fair amount of share and value over the last few years after Woolies doing well for a period of time. We'll do one more. So who are these two fine young gentlemen?
The Afterpay founders?
They are. Yep, this is Anthony and Nick, who are the two. They were joint CEOs, but they sort of restructured, and Anthony's now the CEO, and Nick's the US CEO. So they could both still keep CEO. So quite a different market. So suddenly we've stepped into a tech space. What's top of mind for these gents?
Actually, how do they become profitable in the long term?
Yeah, well, making a profit might be, it's probably a big one. What's the road to profitability?
Regulations.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a bit of people are turning to that and thinking a bit more about regulation. Yeah.
Who's going to come
How
in?
How are they going to expand geographically?
So, someone else was Jason.
I was going to say, who's going to come in and compete with them? Are the big banks going to try and take their space?
Yeah, I think in this about the big banks, I think Klarna and there's some other ones there that are already starting to cut into some of their market share in different places. And there's some big global competitors that are pretty hairy that they'll be starting to think about a little bit as well. I think expansion definitely one. Like they're just rolling out heavily in the US. That'll be taking a massive amount of their focus. I also think there's another one here around the customer or consumer and what they want. You know, how is my product continuing to evolve and to be delivering that particularly the tech side of the experience that the customer wants and the consumer wants. The way I plug into different sales channels and things like that is probably one, because they're very much offering a service, but there's a massive sort of tech integration customer experience side that makes it in terms of how they sell. I do know that there's actually someone that's white labeling an Afterpay type service, so a buy now, pay later type service. And the intent being there that one of the pain points of Afterpay from a consumer is that I have to set up an account, might take a bit longer and things like that. From a customer or merchant side, they lose the data. They don't actually own the customer for the actual purchase. So there's a lot of data they're missing out on. So the company has come in and said, hey, we'll provide a white label service so you can offer Coles buy now, pay later service or whatever that is. And we'll do the plumbing, but they're still through your system, your account, and through so you own the data and they still stay closer to the customer. That's an interesting one, and where the merchants sort of find in that, and you can sort of see Amazon going down, potentially doing that model at some point. whether they might do it fully internally. So those are some of the substitutes or the shifts in the market that might start taking this year. Cool. So I've got a quote up here, but I want to sort of talk about the question. So none of us are CEOs, although if one or two might have aspirations to be a CEO. So, but why am I sitting here telling you that I think being able to do this and think like a CEO is really important? And I've got a quote there which sort of starts to get to the point. But we're employed by, as a consultant, you're employed by a senior business leader to help them with their biggest problems. A good consultant can empathize and get to the core of the key things driving a business, and the solutions need to resonate. So there's a few things in there, and maybe I'll sort of run through a couple of thoughts and then I get what you think. But one, CEOs, employers. So CEO, and generally if you're in particularly some of the bigger firms and the more expensive firms, that's a CEO decision generally. You're brought in to solve the biggest problems, which are going to be the things that are top of mind for the CEO, or an EGM or other very senior people within the business. You need to be able to understand, to solve the problem, to understand the core things driving the business right across the spectrum. And the solutions you come up with actually have to resonate with them. They actually have to, you have to be able to convince them of the answer that you've got. And if you're not able to think like a CEO, I don't think you can do any of those things particularly well. But any other thoughts on why? I mean, I've got to have a list in a second of some stuff that I threw together about why. But why do we see this for case interviews? Because we're, one, this is really important to be a good consultant. But why in a case interview am I telling you that I think this is a really important skill?
Because at the end, you need to be able to sum up everything and basically tell the CEO your answer in like 2 seconds. And if they can't, if you're not sort of meeting that criteria of thinking like them, then you're going to miss the mark.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, very true. What about more at the front end when you're thinking about the problem itself and how you might approach it? And
you've really got to be able to read the room when you're in the interview or with a client. Even if you've got all the smarts, if you can't actually interpret what the problem is that they're telling you.
Yep. I think there's another one here around generic answers. People that can't do this well get a problem, and it's a profitability problem. So they give a generic answer. So because they haven't thought like the CEO and been able to understand outside in without knowing anything about the industry, really, a little bit about that business and enough to add some external flavor to the structure and the way they're thinking about the case. And I hated generic answers. So if someone came in, when I'm practicing with people and when someone came in and they gave me an answer that I sort of thought, well, actually, they could have given me that answer to any profitability problem for any company in any industry. I think that's a wrong answer. No matter how elegant it is structured and thought out, that's a wrong answer. You've given me a generic answer to a problem. And we're not talking about generic problems. We're talking about real businesses, real CEOs, where we want people that can go in and sympathize with the client and be able to solve the real problems of those business. And so I think this is critical. I think the second point, and it links to the in-case brainstorm, the business awareness, and business judgment. I don't want a common pitfall is giving answers that aren't sense checked. And it might be anything from, I think we can capture 80, yes, we should do this because we're going to capture 80% of the market in 2 years. It could be that you've done your maths wrong. There's a couple of extra zeros, and suddenly the EBIT is $7 billion instead of 700 million or something like that. And so the people that don't think like this don't tend to have that good business awareness or the ability to sense check and think about their answers. And either in terms of that real just, am I in the right scale here or that? But also, does this answer actually make sense? Is this implementable? Is this would I be able to actually work with the client and actually be able to do this and carry through this answer? What are the risks? And so I think it's a massively important skill and thing to practice, because it gives you that ability to customize your answer, to really sense check what you're doing, to put yourself in the shoes in terms of the pathway you might want to take, and then how it might be implemented. Is it implementable? What might the risks be? And all of a sudden, your answer's gone from a very exam type answer to a much richer answer. You've shown that you can actually think about that business and put it in context and have something that is much more real and the type of answers that we're looking for as consultants. So in terms of some stuff I wrote down, like there's the point before that senior people that think like this are the ones that are higher consultants and consulting firms. So they're very, very conscious of being able to engage and think and resonate with them. A case is not an exam. And this is another one that I see that in people that don't do that well in cases is they treat it like an MBS exam. Particularly some of the more technical ones. So like you think about operations or you think about finance and stuff like that. All right, the answer is 27.6. We're done. Good, I've scored it, I've done it. When that's really not the end. I mean, for start, you're only probably trying an approximate answer. You're not getting something really precise. It's really only an answer and it's really only a good solution if it's actually implementable and the client can actually do something with it and it makes sense for the real problem they're trying to answer and things like that. You may actually be probably most of the time be doing cases on industries you don't know much about. And that said, it's okay to not know much about the industry. But if someone can't at least take a step back and think about the industry in a way that they can add some color and some thought and a bit more to the case than just then I don't think they've done a very good job, because we're hiring MBAs and these firms are hiring MBAs. So they want people that are inquisitive, that are thoughtful, that read the newspaper and can at least from their own experiences think about an industry or think about a business and have a view, and it might not be the right view, but have a sounded out reasonable view of what's driving that business or what the key components are and things like that. And so I have heard people say, but I don't know anything about this industry. I'm like, well, yeah, sure, but you do, because you either buy the product or you've read a bit in the newspaper, or you can make it analyze, make it similar to something you do know something about. So that's so people that go that path, I think that's a little bit of a cop out. It's okay to ask questions about particular things, and particularly technical industries in a case, but you do need to be able to sort of step back and think about any industry and any business in a way that in something you might not actually know anything about or worked in or anything like that. I think that's really important in cases. You may get asked. So there's a Bain video going around from a number of years ago. I think it's on YouTube, which shows 3 different people doing a case with a partner, and they each give an answer, and then the partner talks about, well, which was the best answer. They're all sort of good answers, and which is the best answer. He actually almost has this question at the start of it. He actually says, if you were running this company, what would be top of mind, or what would be the main things for you? So look, they can actually come up even in this form as a part of a case. Now, not often, I'll be fair, but it can. And so there is just that part of it as well, that you might get asked to think like this. And this sort of back to this one, generic answers are wrong answers. So say big red flag for me if someone just rolls out a structure that I sort of thought, well, could that be this case, or could it be dog food profitability? Could it be afterpay profitability? Could be any company in any industry or that, and it's just the framework that they've thought about for profitability, not adapted and customized for this problem and this business. And look, the other one here is, as I said, the answer needs to pass a sniff test. So that's the checking your answers, putting it in context. Is this actually implementable? Have I done the maths right? And does that actually make sense in terms of the size of this market, or the amount of profit we might generate, or the market share we might be able to get, or the relative margin on, we've calculated it's a 500% margin. Maybe that's 50% margin, or 5%. It's sort of, unless there's a real belief, you believe that they're making a huge amount of money on something. And so, yeah, you need to really be able to show good business judgment. And so I know I've talked about this one a little bit from more about thinking like a CEO, but I think that's linked to the business judgment. And I think you're smart enough to get the importance of applying good business judgment through a case. And this is one way to really be able to do that. And to put that in context, I remember a lot of times when we do catch-ups after interviews, we'd evaluate candidates and decide who we're going to put through. reasonable amount of times you'd say, look, they were good, but they didn't show good business awareness or good business judgment. They didn't bring any outside information, and they didn't sort of sense check the answers. They didn't think about if it was implementable. They didn't pick up that COVID, the CEO is really worried about the people. They didn't think about the broader things that are ongoing here, and just focused on the exam part of the problem. So how do you practice this? Well, doing the MBA is a great help. So the classes on that. So the strategy cases you do, the case HBR cases that look at different companies and different industries, different things. They got really good practice. Do it for fun. So I find the people that are good at this are the people that sort of sit there having a coffee and going, hey, how would I make this cafe seems quiet. How would I make it better? Or the Officeworks CEO was in the paper the other day. Wow, I wonder what's going on in that business. What's happening there, and how would I think about that? And so, you need to find other people that don't think you're crazy by wanting to have those sorts of conversations, but sort of you need to be thinking that way and having those sort of conversations, because that's a really good way to practice it. What's topical at the moment, or that, and be thinking through and talking about that with your MBA, on VC with your groups as part of your MBA classes, and syndicate groups and things like that. But wherever it is, be practicing it. And I suggest actually start cases with it. So I started doing that when I do practice cases with people, and it might not be part of the actual case prescription, but start the case and say, hey, see your CEO of this company, what's top of mind? And actually, do that as a structured way for a while to actually force each other to think like that, and then have a little bit of a conversation about it, and then get into the actual real part of the case. And look, I thought I'd finish with a quote, and good consultants get the analysis right and present it in well-formatted slides. That's a good consultant, but great consultants do that, but they understand what it means for the client. And I don't think you can do the second one without being able to do this well and think like a CEO and show that good business judgment and awareness. That's that topic. So any questions or thoughts on that before we move on? Take a few minutes.
Yeah, I guess, can you give an example of a really a bad generic question? Because when you were describing it in my head, I'm like, does he just mean they should cut costs or all that kind of stuff? Or
no, so it's profitability. Someone says, here's how I'm going to structure it. Whatever case, it's a profitability case, and they say, awesome. The way I'm going to approach this is profitability is, revenue, profit equals revenue minus costs. Revenue is made up of fixed, price and volume. Costs are fixed and variable. I want to look at the customers and I will look at the competition to understand that a bit more. I might look at their value chain and what they're doing, and I might look at the consumer and what's changed over time. Actually, it's true. You might do all those things, but if this case is set in a particular part of the business or industry, I would know that. You could give me that exact same word for word answer for any case. You've not woven anything in that I've told you in the problem brief on what they're trying to achieve. You've not woven anything in about how you might think about that market and what you might already know from first principles and thinking like a CEO about that industry. So you're starting to weave it. What's the good starts to do is to go, hey, I know this. Let's say this market's quite of flour. Flour milling in Australia is quite commoditized. So I actually suspect that because of that, there's potentially going to be quite a lot of price pressure, and therefore I get a feeling that we could have a balance between driving prices coming down and the ability to take cost out. I'm thinking about that, and therefore what I might want to look at is start by delving in and seeing if that's what's happening in the market, and seeing what the competitors are doing and how consolidated and what the competition is in this market. See how that's suddenly a much richer, better answer than the first one I gave you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Kieran.
And one of the biggest problems, biggest things I see with people in case is you practice case and you want to use frameworks and all this sort of stuff. But in the end, it's an individual problem with an individual company. So the framework is the skeleton, and you need to hang on what you've been told, what you know, what you think, and customize that to that particular industry or problem or business. Any other thoughts or questions?
Kieran, you mentioned a couple times that it's good to sense check your answers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just walk us through what that would actually look like?
Yeah, so you've done a calc, and you say two ways. One is you've done a calc and you come out and you go, okay, look, I believe this is a $70 trillion industry of ping pong balls in Australia, being sold in Australia. The first, I mean, that's exactly, but that first sense check is to go, actually, does that even remotely make sense? I need to check my maths here. I was going to go back and check my maths here. The second one is gets a little bit more subtle. The other end of the scale might be, oh wow, this company's got some real issues here. I think there's a couple of parts of the business that are quite unprofitable and we might want to look to sell. So I think that should be the recommendation. But what if your context is that it's a deeply held family-run business of 100 years? Do you start to think differently about how you might flavor that answer with that problem and sense check it in terms of them actually being able to, it might still be the right answer, but it's going to be a much different way you're going to tell them about it. Or you might think, actually, we might need to focus a little bit more on how we can turn these around, because there's probably quite a lot of emotional investment with that. And so we got to think about implementing that. It might be like I do a case on integration, and a lot of people forget and they go, we can do this and this, and we can cram these two offers together to get these savings. Sure. But no one mentions, well, what impact it's going to have on people, how we're going to manage that, how are we actually going to, what are the risks associated with doing that? When the money shows that there's $10 million a year saving to be made by dropping this office and combining it with this other one. Sure, that's true. But then also think about, but we'd also have to think about, are they geographically aligned? What's the commute difference going to be for the 100, 200 people we're moving from one to the other? That's starting to sense check your answer in a different way. And is it implementable? What does it mean? Well, how do I put that back into a real picture?
Thanks.
Cool. Let's keep going. So next one is this in-case brainstorming. And so I thought I'm going to start with what I mean by that. And so I'm going to go back to a real world example. So it was 2016, I think it was probably February. It was a round one McKinsey interview that I was doing. And it was a construction industry, Australian-based construction industry case, so building commercial construction. And the McKinsey consultant I've chosen that picture deliberately that I think actually is a McKinsey consultant, and he looks like a McKinsey consultant because there's two sorts of consultants that work at McKinsey: people that look a little bit left field like that, and people that look that look like they spend way too much money on their clothes and wear really tight t-shirts. That tend to be the younger ones, and you can see them in the airports. And the story there goes, when I was traveling back from New Zealand a lot. With a case, and there's a McKinsey team working with one of Fonterra, one of the other ones that I'm off on the same flights, and they'd actually get to the airport and then go and get changed out of their suits and come out in like really tight jeans and tight t-shirts, and stand around in the airport. So I actually can back that up. But so let's say my McKinsey interviewer that looks a little bit random like that says, ask me, we're doing this case. He set it up and he said, well, what do you think the major costs are for a large construction company? This actually happened. So rather than giving me an exhibit, he asked me the question and asked me to think about it and tell him. And I do this actually quite a bit in a couple of cases that I give as well, and go, well, what do you think the cost structure looks like for this business? The case that I'm working in. So who wants to have a go at answering that in terms of, let's say it's an Australian commercial construction doing high rise and sort of buildings like that, and you want to, and it's a cost, you're sort of trying to get to the bit of where we might save on costs or where the cost and cost issues might be. But you've said, oh, I'd love to see what their cost breakdown is. He's like, cool, well, what do you think the main components of that are? Yeah, I think, Jason, you got the voice out first. I think you and Rashmi went at the same time, but have a go, Jason.
Sure. So in construction, I'd expect the first cost would be the labor.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're basically doing a physical thing on site.
And it's Australia, right? It's unionised and very expensive labour.
Exactly. Next, when they start a big development, I expect them to finance it. So their financing cost, interest, where that's coming from. What else? That would be the opportunity cost of what they choose. So
no, I'm thinking more P&L type costs.
Okay. Then there'll just be the back end consultants, all the subcontractors, materials,
Yep. Yeah, and so I think like and I sort of put together a list. I didn't have financing on there, but that's a fair one to add. And like I sort of said, if you're thinking about the big costs, if I'm building, what is it? It's, well, I'm going to have to. There's a lot of labour, and it's Australia after all, so it's going to be quite expensive. So yeah, the trades, and then you're going to have the sort of supervision, engineering, and management. There's a big couple of types. There's going to be materials, and if I think about the types of materials that in a big building, and I'm an engineer background, so maybe I've got a bit of advantage there, but you've all worked or been in big office buildings or seen them being built. You sort of know that, well, concrete, a lot of concrete goes into these buildings. There's a lot of steel. The whole frame tends to be steel. Glass is a big one. They're all sheathed in these really expensive glass on the outside. And then there's all the services, the lifts, the air conditioning, the IT, and all that sort of stuff that goes into it as well. Tools and machinery, the big cranes, trucks that are delivering stuff, all the tools that they're going to be using to build it. Transport, so all the trucks coming back and forth and delivering stuff all the time. There's going to be a portion of corporate overheads that are going to be assigned to that, so payroll and finance and all those admin type stuff. And then probably the design and architecture. Someone's got to have done the design for that building. Now, I've never worked in that industry. I say I've got a bit more of a background, but like that's a reasonable. I would reasonably expect most candidates to be able to get something similar to that, get 80% of that with maybe some different stuff, or have a reasonably good stab at putting something logical together that looks like that. How does everyone feel about that? Does that feel scary, confronting? You think comfortable that you could probably do that in a case?
Kieran, what I probably find uncomfortable with it is with a really open-ended question, not knowing how granular to be.
Mm-hmm.
Off the bat, you don't want to be, I guess it would be too generic to just say labor and materials would be your two biggest costs. But how far should you go? Should you sort of list 3 dot points?
Good question. So in this case, the context of the case was it was going to be cost out, and where we might be able to save costs. So I think you need to, in that point, be granular enough that you can actually start to think about that. So for example, labor, so I think this sort of level's about right. Because I sort of get a feel, because I can sort of go, okay, well, what are the levers I'm going to have to reduce costs, and at what level am I going to want to think about those? And so, you're obviously also about a time, and so you've only got 30 seconds to a minute to do this, so you're not going to go super granular, and you want to sort of talk them through, not write a list and then come back. Don't take a minute and write a list. You want to sort of go, okay, well, let me think through this. I think there's going to be this, and write a list of 5 to 8 things. And then if the case needs you to go more granular in a particular area, either you'll sort of have a vibe on that because you'll know that the case is heading that way, and say, actually, I think we should go more in depth onto this one because I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity there. Or the interviewer will say, yeah, I think that's a really good list. I think the opportunity we've identified is really in the materials. So maybe let's go a bit deeper into some of the materials and what that list might look like.
Kieran, would you stay quite structured here as well? I mean, I remember my first round Bain interview, one of the feedbacks that I got was that I didn't stay structured in the brainstorming. So they would have liked me to go, I think the variable costs are the labor and materials, and the fixed costs would be tools, transport, and overhead. So that was one of the feedback that I got. I just wanted to get your view on it.
And here's fixed and variable, or internal, external is another great one. So if you think about more of, and we'll do it in a second, actually professional services type company, I'd probably use a more internal, external type construct for the cost. So that sort of structure. But this is still relatively structured. Maybe it could be a bit more. But I've got labor, then I've got a couple of sorts of labor. I've thought materials, and I've got 3 or 4 sets and types of materials. And so it's interesting. The fixed and variable is kind of hard unless it's really obvious. If it's a manufacturing one, more so, really good, because it's like, hey, well, if it's materials, it's variable. If it's the factory and the property and that, it's more fixed. But often you get quite mixed up. It's really, like, even finance teams go, well, we're not sure. We don't really. We sort of half count this as variable. It could be, but it's not, and you get quite a lot of grey. So let's go for another one. Let's have someone have a go. So what about a large ASX 200 professional services company? So think a bank, think an insurer, think like engineering consultancy. So there's like a Wally Parsons, think law firm, all those sort of big stuff. They don't actually make anything. They sell people, basically, or people's time of some form. who wants to have a go at there? Rashmi, you jumped in on the construction one. Do you have a go at this one?
Yeah, I can have a go. So I think if it's a professional services company, the largest cost would be the labor cost, particularly given that, people are producing all the work and the value.
And so just as a call out, that's good. And Sam, when you do a question about structure, that's a structured answer. What's the biggest and why? And then, so that is adding structure and logic to the way that Rashmi's working through it. Sorry, go on.
All right. Sorry, just to clarify, is this just about costs or can it be about other assets and things as well?
Costs.
That's purely costs.
P&L costs.
Okay, P&L costs. Okay. I would think about, presuming there's any acquisitions that it's made, then any goodwill and brand that they've acquired.
So intangible expenses?
Yeah, intangible expenses. The third would be around, I think, head of corporate office, possibly.
See, now I'm starting to get a little bit less structured and a little bit more muddled.
Yeah.
And so what I really encourage you to do here is think about the companies you work in or have worked in and say, hey, if I'm at Australia Post or I'm at one of the banks or I'm at whatever companies you work for, what can I just think about what are the big cost stuff that's associated that are easy to understand and for that business? And so I'd sort of think an answer like this is a pretty good one just to start with. So as you say, labor, for instance, is going to be the biggest by far. Property, all these they have big buildings, either own or lease. The mechanism could be a bit different, but property, they often have properties and they might have a whole heap of branch offices then around the place. If it's an insurer or something, and not a non-digital or something like that, banks and anything like that. IT is always a big cost. So everyone's got a laptop. You're all sitting there on a work laptop. They've also got servers and all the infrastructure around that. They, once again, might be leased, might be owned, doesn't really matter. It's still a cost at some point. Software, licenses, software as a service, all the stuff that goes on to those laptops. Externally, you might start to think about external services. So all big firms employ lawyers, accountants, consultants. That's always a line item. Travel, so airfares and hotels and things like that, because a lot of these firms in the pre-COVID would fly people around to a lot of different places a lot of the time that have big events and training budgets and all that sort of stuff. Training is an interesting probably one you could add. And then sort of sales and marketing. If I'm selling something to a customer, I'm going to have to promote it in sales and do that sales and marketing. Now, you can add more. I'm not saying this is a complete me-see kind of list, but that's a good start. That's a good start about an industry. And I think you should be able to get there to something similar to this about any industry, even if you don't know much about it. Does that seem unreasonable in terms of an expectation from an interviewer? For an MBA, MBS, MBA student wanting to be a consultancy, to be able to get to a really straw man skeleton cost structure for any sort of major type of business. I don't think it is. I think it's very reasonable. And in fact, it's what I expected when one of my key interview case that I used the last few years when I was actually interviewing people to join Bain. Now, the second question becomes, how many of you actually feel comfortable about being able to do that?
A bit of practice, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I think it doesn't actually come up in every case. It might only come up in a couple out of 10 cases. But you can two things. One, when it directly comes up, you need to be able to do it well. And two, if it doesn't, do you think in a cost out or a profitability case, being able to think like this is helpful, even if it's not asked explicitly? Yeah, I think it is. And look, let's be clear. I don't think there's that many business types. So you can actually cheat and look at the different create 5 or 6 different buckets of business and have a think about the cost base of them. Because 50% of your cases are profitability. How many of those have cost is something you're going to look at. How might you think, if you know that there's a cost problem, it's flagged in the another example, if a cost was sort of hinted or flagged in the problem statement, and in your structure you said, I think we're going to need to look at costs here and internal costs, or the cost base. And I think the big buckets for this business might be this, 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 and this. That suddenly starts to become a very good answer to how I've structured the problem. It's specific, it's thoughtful, you're showing business awareness, you're showing that you're thinking about the right things. So I think being able to do this well is something that it's not easy, but it's not hard to get good at if you think about it and you go away and go away and work on it a little bit. And so once again, a way to practice is to throw it into cases when you're practicing, even if the case itself doesn't ask you to do it. So rather than give the table with the cost breakdown, well, what do you think the cost? Yeah, we had some information, but what do you think the costs are? And get them to have a go at it. You can start to blend that into cases. And so, and I sort of said there, this is sort of extenuation of that. You can actually use first principles. So, and this is what I found a little bit, not frustrating, but interesting, I suppose, when I was interviewing, and I did actually, the professional services insurer, I had a case about insurance integration, and I asked that exact question: what do you think the main cost components are? And the number of people in Australia that got it was low. And I'm sort of thinking, but you work for X company, you have a laptop, you know the IT, you walk into a big fancy building, you know that they employ lots of people, and you can only get one or two things, and you start to get on these real random stuff that's not relevant. It always shocked me that people at an MBA level couldn't do the basics. And I'm not asking for much more than what's a version of what's on the slide here. How would we adapt the left if it was a manufacturing? So I'm sort of helping here. We're up to the third of about 5 or 6 industries that you might need to know the answer for. What if this was a manufacturing company? How would we change the left?
I think we have raw materials as one.
Yeah. What's the difference? So let's start with what's the difference in a manufacturing company or professional services?
We'd elevate the property like the hard assets. So that would probably be the first. Top of the
agree. So, but the question, what's the difference? So the difference is they're making something, and they have to make it somewhere. They're either manufacturing it themselves or they're buying the product. So that's and then so that's the first level. So you can go, as you say, okay, well, so all of a sudden you can have a really big cost item on cost of goods, the actual materials that go into it. They're going to have a lot more. You're going to have a logistics line where they have to ship stuff or move stuff around. The property is going to become a lot more important. And actually, there's probably not that much different after that. Maybe you can have a think about it a little bit more. What about the other way? What about a tech company? So Afterpay, if this was Afterpay.
It would be pretty similar to this, I would imagine.
Kind of similar, yeah. I don't think it'd be that much different. I think you might think about there's a lot more marketing. You might elevate the sales and marketing, because a lot of these tech companies do well by really promoting the product hard, because you sort of got to win share of wallet. But it's probably not that different. It's pretty labor intensive. You got a lot of code. It's quite a hot market for things like that. Property, you might not be in a big fancy office in the middle of the city, so maybe that. So there's some subtle changes, but probably not that different. Just got to think about what other sorts of questions you might get that you might need to brainstorm on. And I don't have a great list here. I'm seeing if you guys might be able to help contribute as well. But another one is growth. How might you grow? What's some ideas for how you might grow revenue in this business? The advice here: start with the Antoff matrix. So you've got, we can grow. We can grow in terms of geographically. We can grow in terms of different adjacent markets, and you can sort of come up with a structured way to approach that. Because that's one that does often come up: is how might you think about growing the revenue for this business? Market share. Once again, the same sort of thing. How might I grow market share, and some ways that I might be able to do that. What are some considerations, and this could be about anything, what are some considerations, so in my case, what are some considerations you might have for integrating 2 offices to save cost? Cool. Well, once again, that's something you might have to brainstorm 2 or 3 things, other considerations of things you might want to think about. And there might be some others. And I'll ask in a second what are some others that you run into in cases that you're aware of. But, you know, start with something you know and work from there. If I was for construction, if I was building a house, actually the sort of, and so I was building my, like paying someone to build a house for me. I can picture that. So it's going to be a scaled up version of that. If I'm in integration, well, what if I was in one of those offices and I was the person being moved and merged with an office across town? What would be, you know, what would be going on, or I was managing that project? So sort of try and put yourself into the situation, or get it to something that you can think a little bit more about, and then expand it off there. Are there any other sorts of things, common ones you've seen in cases you've done where this sort of thing comes up?
Market entry.
Yep, that's another one that does come up.
Oh, sorry, but that's similar to growth actually.
Kind of, yeah. It's just a sort of a bit more structured view of sort of a bit more focused view of growth. So I think the sort of takeaway on terms of I actually did write some top tips. So it was good to me last night. Some top tips on how to think about this and do it well. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. It does sort of need to be structured into the point before. So you do want to think about whether it's internal, external costs, whether it's Ansoff matrix sort of structured view on growth. You got to think of a way to bring some sort of structure. Whether you're saying, okay, well, what are the biggest costs going to be? I think that the core of their industry is this, so therefore the cost is this. For manufacturing, it might be, okay, well, there's going to be costs associated with making the product, costs associated with moving the product, and then overheads and things like that come into it. So you just, you know, some way adding a little bit of structure at a higher level before you delve slightly more granular without getting too granular. It does need to be reasonably messy, so you can't just, you know, you do need to think across the board. So, you know, missing IT and property off the professional services is sort of not gone broad enough. Often people forget the sales and marketing if it's selling something, all the external costs of lawyers, accountants, and so on. So you want to get a range, and you don't need the full range. So I think to be completely messy, but you need to have sort of stuff across the spectrum that you're not just focused on one or two parts. Start with what you know and extrapolate. So I work for a big company. What were the big, and this is what I did when people struggle with that question on my insurance case, say, well, you work for a big company. What do you think the major costs are for your company? And I was really frustrated when people go, I don't know. Like I got that as an answer at the time. Like, well, you work in a big company and you're not able to sit there and have a conversation with me about what you think the costs, key costs of that business are. You're not right for this job. Like literally, that's sort of where you start to head. Common useful frameworks. So either create, so Ansoff is one, or create them. So costs. There's 5 or 6 different types of major companies, businesses. We've done 3 or 4 of them already. So you're already well on your way to sort of jotting down some notes about what they might be. And you can probably think of some of the other common ones as well. Practice it. So weave it into cases, even when it's not there, so you can actually practice and think about it. And don't lose sight of the problem. If you're trying to solve something, don't get too granular or into a part of the but it's not really that useful. So, for example, I love the point about intangibles before, but if that was a case that was about cost saving or integration or cost reduction, you can sort of mention it, but it's not something you're really going to be able to get to worry about too much in that particular context of that case. So you can say that, hey, big cost here, I don't think it's going to be something we can look at. And so that's starting to link it back to the problem and overlay that sort of insight. In terms of contextualizing, Andy, yeah, 100%. If you can contextualize it with what you know about particular companies that are similar, or that, and you've got to, this comes back to think like a CEO. It needs to be specific to the type of problem. So if we're talking about a particular manufacturing firm and they were making something COVID vaccine, you'd go, okay, well, the health and safety aspects of it are going to be really high. The machinery is really specialized. You know, you can actually start to bring in that think like a CEO way to give exactly that, contextualize the cost base and sort of provide that sort of that little bit of color to what you're saying. Grow your business awareness. So read the paper. You know, this helps you think like a CEO as well, and sort of get to know a few different industries just at a superficial level. Any questions on that? I'm sort of running tight on time, but I think we've got clearing slides. We can get to that in 15. Maybe we're okay to run a little bit late on the content, Sam.
Absolutely. I think most of the students will get more out of you talking anyway.
Flattery get you everywhere, mate. Any questions on that one? I hope you can all see it's important, and you can see that it's something I think you can practice and something you can think about. So I hope, my hope is that now you're aware of how I see it being important, that you can bring it into how you practice case, and you can think about it in a way that means that when you get this comes up in whatever form in a case, you're much more comfortable with doing it.